The topic that we'll be discussing tonight, inshallah, is the topic of fearing Allah in the seerah of the Ahlul Bayt, and in particular, in the seerah of Lady Fattimiya Zahra. This is something that we find all over the seerah of the Ahlul Bayt, fearing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in particular, when it comes to Lady Fattimiya Zahra, we find this in different aspects of her life. One of those instances where Lady Fattimiya Zahra spoke of the issue of taqwa, fearing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, was those moments when she came in this famous khutbah that's known as khutbah Fattimiya, when she came into the masjid, and some narrations say that they set up a curtain between her and the audience in the masjid, and she began speaking to the khulafa and of course the rest of the people who were in the masjid. And as part of this long khutbah that multiple sources have narrated, she mentioned, ittaqullaha haqqa tuqatihi, fear Allah the way He deserves to be feared. وَلَا تَمُوتُنَّ إِلَّا وَأَنْتُمْ مُسْلِمُونَ, and do not leave this world unless that you have submitted to the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. She continues in a number of lines in that khutbah, and of course the khutbah itself is a very long khutbah. The idea of fearing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is something you find all over her seerah. The narrations tell us that when the time of salat used to come and she would prepare for salat, that the Ahlul Bayt would go pale during those times. That Lady Fatima in her salat would cry out of the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of those titles that have been granted to her is At-Taqiyya, meaning the lady who fears Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so on and so forth. We also find this in her beloved husband. The cries of Imam Ali late during the night, when everybody else is asleep, is well known to us in history. Shia and Sunni speak about the spirituality that the Imam carried and how the fear of Allah played a role in this spirituality. However, this concept of fearing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not as simple as it seems. It is one of those topics that is very nuanced. It is complex. And it's one of those topics that if it's not understood correctly, it can either make someone very harsh in their religion, or it can make someone feel completely disconnected from their faith altogether. Why? Because fear, we know, is one of the emotions Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted to us. In today's world and in the lives that we live, fear is very crucial, it's very important. Why? Because there are dangers in this world. If you don't fear illness, you will not take your hygienic precautions. What that means is that you will end up becoming ill. If you don't fear an accident, that means you won't put on your seatbelt when you get in the car, which means you are now vulnerable to the dangers that are there in the lives that we live. Fear is an important tool that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instilled in the human being when it came to the threats and the dangers that he comes across in this world. All of this makes sense. Fear, as an emotion, we understand the role that it plays. The complexity of the topic begins when someone turns around to you, the Quran tells you, the Ahlul Bayt tell you that you should fear Allah. Well, we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not some danger of some sort. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not out to get me. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is merciful, all these other things that we read in the Quran and in narrations. So what does it mean to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? This is an important question that comes to mind. And unless we address it and understand it in the nuanced way that the Ahlul Bayt and the Quran understood it, we will not understand this element and this teaching of Quran and Ahlul Bayt. And therefore you find today in our communities, people react differently to the topic of fearing Allah. There are those who will come forward and say, listen, Allah is merciful, Allah is kind. This fearing Allah was not one of the teachings of Quran and Ahlul Bayt. Set this aside. This is a misunderstanding. This is not really what they said. Sometimes they even have good intentions when they say this, yes? This is their understanding. There are others who come forward and say, listen, worshipping Allah out of fear is not even spiritual. You should worship Allah out of love. You should worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because He is worthy of being worshipped. Referencing the famous narration of the first Imam, Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi. They say, listen, worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of fear, this is not spiritual. You should worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because He is worthy of being worshipped. Don't mention this fear thing. And at another level, others will come forward and say, listen, why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring up this fear anyways? Why didn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just tell us about the rewards of the good deeds that He wants us to do? Yes? This gentle parenting. Why didn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala apply a little gentle parenting when it came to us? Instead of telling me if you don't pray, you'll deal with this punishment and that punishment, why didn't He just tell me more about the rewards if I do end up praying? Why don't you tell me more about the rewards of fasting if I do end up fasting? Why did He have to use this tactic and this approach? Hence you find the topic of fearing Allah is not as simple as it seems. It seems we have to dig deeper into this topic to understand what the Quran and Ahl Bayt had to share as it relates to fearing Allah. And in order to do so, in order to delve into this topic, we'll pose the following questions. Number one, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not a dangerous entity, if He is merciful, like so many verses in Ahadith tell us, then why does the Quran and Ahl Bayt speak about fearing Allah? Why even bring this up to begin with? Number two, if I fear Allah on a practical level, what does that look like? Does that mean I live a life of fear, or does that fear turn into tranquility? Number three, if a person fears Allah, does that mean he never ends up committing sins? Or does the Quran describe a person who fears Allah as a person who at times does end up listening to shaitan, does end up being tricked by shaitan as well? Number four, what is the greater level of fearing Allah that we find in the Ahl Bayt, that we find in the angels, that has nothing to do with expecting punishment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Number five, is it true that worshipping Allah out of fear is not spiritual, and that I should aim to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only out of love, and that He is worthy of my worship? And number six, and finally, when I remember the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and I lose hope in the sinful life that I live, what should I remember when it comes to the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and those who represent that mercy, that is the Ahlul Bayt and Lady Fatima, that give me hope in life, inshallah? Tonight, inshallah, we'll delve into these 6 questions with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Let us begin from here, brothers and sisters. Fear is something that makes sense in our day-to-day life, yes? Because at the end of the day, in this world that we live in, there are many dangers, there are many threats. A human being who doesn't have fear is a naive human being. That is a human being, we look at him, we say, you're too simplistic, yes? If you've ever had a child who's 2, 3 years old, and he wants to cross the road, he hasn't developed a sense of fear yet, you know how stressful that is for the parents and how dangerous that is for that child. In fact, the parents wait for that day to come where he develops a sense of fear. They say this is healthy, this is good for him, because we live in a world where there are dangers, there are threats. All of this makes sense, but it's a completely different ballgame when you turn around and say fear Allah. Ittaqullah, because now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not seem to be this dangerous entity, doesn't seem to be this threat that you have to constantly look out for. And the interesting reality is that the Quran speaks about fearing Allah in a multitude of different ways. It's almost like as if you cannot read the verses of the Quran unless you come across a verse that brings up the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not one of those concepts that you can kind of just set aside and say, listen, these are the main teachings of the Quran. This fear thing doesn't come up often. No, it comes up very often. This issue of fearing Allah, let me be very frank, is like the elephant in the room. It's like the elephant in the room when people discuss Islamic spirituality. Because most people, when they discuss Islamic spirituality, they discuss it in a different way where fear never comes up. So then this big thing is sitting there. All these verses of the Quran are sitting there where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala constantly said, Ittaqullah. Sometimes He used that terminology. Sometimes He used the terminology of the khashya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes He said there are people who have rahbah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes he said there are people who are mushfiqun, they are fearful of the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A multitude of different vocabulary the Quran and Hadith has used to refer to the same concept. It's one of those things you cannot miss. You open the Quran, Alif Lam Mim, yes? Because you and I, we only read the first couple pages. The pages that have the good prints, yes? The pages that have the nice decoration around them. These are only pages of Quran, unfortunately, we read. We read those pages, Alif Lam Mim, the Quran quickly says, there's muttaqeen. You better be amongst the muttaqeen. Hudan lil muttaqeen. It's one of those things you cannot escape. So what does it mean to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not a dangerous entity, this is where we have to begin our discussion. When you look at the verses of the Quran, you find that though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses this fear to himself at times, at other times in the verses of the Quran, he addresses this fear to something else. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to the human being at different levels. Because the audience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran are not all same level. There's laymen amongst them. There's the philosopher amongst them. Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took a more nuanced approach. And this is how the Quran speaks to us. The Quran speaks to us on different issues at different levels, not always at the same level. So the Qur'ans came sometimes to discuss this topic on a deeper level. What did the Qur'an say? The Qur'an said at a deeper level, listen, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, fear me because you will be punished, it's not like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, na'udhu billah, gets angry with you. Na'udhu billah, he's impacted by emotions the way you and I are impacted by emotions. When you disobey him, he becomes angry and then he snaps his fingers and this punishment appears. No. There's something else that's happening here. These deeds that you commit, they have a spiritual reality to them, the same way they have a physical reality behind them. The physical reality, bound by time and place. You are familiar with them. Yes? You prayed, you fasted, na'udhu billah, you were backbiting. These are all bound by time and place. The moment they're done, they're finished. The Quran said there's a spiritual reality to these deeds as well. And what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does on the day of judgment is He removes this veil so that you have the opportunity to see the spiritual realities of your own deeds. Fear the spiritual reality of your deeds. Those deeds have a spiritual reality. If they are amongst the deeds that the Sharia has called haram, their spiritual reality will present themselves in the next world as a form of punishment. As a painful form. They have spiritual realities. Where does the Quran talk about this? In multitude verses, the Quran speaks of it. The simplest one that you and I are all familiar with in Surah Al-Zilzal. إِذَا زُلْزِلَتِ الْأَرْضُ زِلْزَالَهَا. Verses continue. فَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ خَيْرًا يَرَهُ. The one who does the atom size of a good deed, يَرَهُ. He will see the deed itself. وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ شَرًّا يَرَهُ. Did the Quran say when you show up on the day of judgment, you will see the reward and punishment of your deeds? Or did the Quran say you will see the deeds themselves? Quran said you'll see the deeds themselves. And the Quran said, listen, these deeds have spiritual realities behind them. Fear the spiritual realities of your deeds. There are consequences to your deeds. Don't live life like an outlaw, giving yourself a free pass to do as you wish. No, a day will come where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will show you the reality of these deeds. And if those deeds are haram deeds, they will be like punishment for you. Fear Allah is the summarized version of this whole discussion. Yes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came in the verses of the Quran and said, fear me, because that is the simple way of putting all of this. Yes? Why? Because He is associated with that day when the veils are removed. Yes? It's very similar to if you went to court, someone has done something wrong, they bring him to a court of law. Is it the judge who is punishing him, or is it the law that's punishing him? It's the law that is punishing him. He's fearful of the judge. Why? Because the judge is overseeing this process. Because the judge is the one who doesn't let him go here or there. Yes? He has to face the consequences of his own deeds. In reality, The deeds themselves carry an evil with them. The law is what has set this punishment for him. The judge is associated with that day. Hence he has fear of who? He has fear of the judge. So Quran says, ittaqillah, fear Allah. Why? Because Allah is scary? No, because your free will that you have can make you create deeds that are horrific. And if you look around in the world today, you will see this very clearly. Every deed of ours has a spiritual reality behind it. This is why we find Shaykh al-Saduq has narrated in this book of his called Al-Amali. He's narrated a beautiful hadith from the beloved Prophet Muhammadin al-Mustafa salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. Where the Prophet came to his companions, he said, last night I had a dream. Yes? وَرَأَيْتُ فِيهَا الْأَعَاجِيبِ, and I saw astonishing things in this dream of mine. We know that the dreams of the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt are on a different level compared to you and I. So his companions turned to them, said, Ya Rasulullah, hadithna bihi, why don't you tell us what you saw in this dream of yours? He said, yes, I saw in my dream people who are dealing with the consequences of their deeds. And you see the Prophet speaks of those deeds like entities. He speaks of those deeds as if they're human beings. As if they're living beings. So the narration is a long narration. He says, I saw this person, he was about to be punished. All of a sudden, one of his good deeds came forward. Came forward as if it's an entity. As if it has a life of its own. And stopped this punishment from taking place. Very long narration. Yes? Of those lines, what did the Prophet say? The Prophet said, last night I saw in my dream, رَجُلًا مِّنْ أُمَّتِي, a person from my ummah. وَقَدْ أَتَاهُ مَلَكُ الْمَوْتِ. Malakul Maut was already on his way لِيَقْبِضَ رُوحَهُ. Malakul Maut was already on his way to take his soul. فَجَاءَهُ بِرُّهُ بِوَالِدَيْهِ. The goodness that he had done to his parents came and stopped Malakul Maut from taking his soul. You see how the Prophet is speaking of these things? He speaks of them as entities because they are realities. He continued. He said, وَرَأَيْتُ رَجُلًا مِّنْ أُمَّتِي, and I saw a man from my ummah, قَدْ بُسِتَ عَلَيْهِ عَذَابُ الْقَبْرِ. The punishment of the grave was already prepared for him. He was about to go through this. So what came and stopped it? فَجَاءَهُ وُضُوءُهُ. His wudu came and stopped this punishment from taking place. وَرَأَيْتُ رَجُلًا مِّنْ أُمَّتِي, I saw another, بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ ظُلْمَةٌ. Every corner he looks, darkness. To his left, to his right, behind him, in front of him, darkness. So what saved him? فَجَاءَهُ حَجُّهُ وَعُمْرَتُهُ. His hajj and umrah came and saved him. Continued. وَرَأَيْتُ رَجُلًا مِّنْ أُمَّتِي, I saw another one of them. The flames of fire were attacking him from every corner. So what saved him? فَجَاءَتْهُ صَدَقَتُهُ. His sadaqah came. فَكَانَتْ ظِلًّا عَلَى رَأْسِهِ. Created a shade upon him. The narration continues as one of the last lines that the Prophet mentioned. He said, I saw a person, he was walking on the bridge of Sirat. Yes? This Sirat that is a complicated thing. What is it? Metaphor, literal, separate discussion. Prophet said, I saw someone walking on the bridge of Sirat, but he could not walk straight. Yes? He was moving left and he was moving right. فَجَاءَهُ صَلَاتُهُ. His salat came and held his hand so he could walk across this bridge of Sirat. The Ahlul Bayt spoke to us. They are bringers of news from a different world. That is the world where your deeds have a spiritual reality behind them. So they come to us from time to time to tell us this deed that you're underestimating, that God called haram, has a terrible spiritual reality behind it. Fear that spiritual reality. You will deal with the consequences of that spiritual reality. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to summarize all of this, at a different level said what? Ittaqullah. Allah is watching. Yes. This is the fear. That is why the Quran sometimes says, fear your deeds. Sometimes it says, wattaqu yawman, fear the day of judgment. Sometimes it says, fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of these are referring to the idea that my actions have consequences and I have to have the humility to accept that if I commit these deeds, there's going to be consequences for them. Yes. But this fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, brothers and sisters, is different from the fear that you and I normally speak of. So Quran went deeper and further even. The Quran then said, what is it going to look like practically when someone fears Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Loud salawat please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. One more salawat please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. If we can move forward please, thank you. One more salawat please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. The final one with the loudest of your voices. The Quran said the person who fears Allah is not a person who walks on the clouds. He's not a person who is ma'soom only. Of course, they fear Allah in their own way. The Quran said, you know how you can tell a person who fears Allah, i.e., has a sense of accountability to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who understands that his deeds have some consequences. The Quran didn't say this person is perfect. He never commits sins. Quran never said this person never does the wrong thing. No. Surah An-Nazi'at, Surah 79, verse 40, 41, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, this is my standard. This is the bare minimum of fearing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If I want to know, do I fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or not? I.e., do I fear the consequences of my deeds or not? So God is not scary. I'm scary. Do I fear the consequences of my deeds or not? The Quran said what? There are people on the Day of Judgment, two groups. The Quran doesn't go into all the different groups of people who are there on the Day of Judgment. For some reason, it's the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, two groups. Sometimes He'll tell you three groups. But then basically He said, listen, at the end of the day, everyone's going to fall into one of these two or three groups. Okay. Quran said, يَوْمَ يَتَذَكَّرُ الْإِنسَانُ مَا سَعَى. Everyone remembers what they did, yes? وَبُرِّزَتِ الْجَحِيمُ لِمَنْ يَرَى. Hellfire has begun, yes? Then people are two groups. وَأَمَّا مَنْ طَغَى. The one who transgresses. وَآثَرَ الْحَيَاةَ الدُّنْيَا. And he preferred the life in this world. فَإِنَّ الْجَحِيمَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَى. His place, hellfire. Okay, then how did the Quran describe the people who don't make it into hellfire? Not only that, they don't burn, they make it into heaven. Did the Quran say these people are always perfect, they never commit any sins? No. The Quran said, وَأَمَّا مَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ. But the one who fears Allah. Ya Allah, tell us, what does it mean to fear Allah practically? So, وَأَمَّا مَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ. You know what this person does? وَنَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ. When he comes across sin, his disposition is to say no to it. His default, say no. Nahi means what? To forbid someone, yes? When he comes across a sin, something inside of him is not sitting well, yes? Something inside of him is not feeling well. Something inside of him tells him, no, you're not supposed to be doing this. Now, question for you. If you forbid someone from committing a sin, does that mean they will never commit that sin? No. Sometimes that person, shaitan tricks them. The Quran said this person is not perfect. The Quran said this person is what? When he comes across sin, he doesn't give himself a green light. Doesn't justify it. No. Deep down, shaitan has to work hard to get him to commit this sin. The Quran said if he has this standard, he is amongst those who خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ. He is fearful of the status of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And hence why in the verses of the Quran, fearing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the forgiveness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala go hand in hand together. Normally when you fear someone, you don't expect mercy from them. Yes? The Quran said if you fear Allah, meaning you have this base level of accountability to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the doors of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala now open upon you. In today's world, and many Muslims within our community, speakers, Muslim influencers, whatever you want to call them, they portray the fear of Allah and the forgiveness of Allah as two competing elements with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
As if what? Forgive me for this terminology. As if one day Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is very forgiving. The other days He's not so forgiving. Sometimes He gets angry very quickly. Then they'll tell you, Shaykh, don't talk about fear, talk about His mercy. As in those days, as if, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is merciful. No, Islam said, the more you fear Allah, the more merciful Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes. These two work hand in hand with one another. If you don't fear Allah, i.e., you give yourself a green light to do as you wish, don't expect the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The base level to qualify for the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what? At least I have a sense of accountability. At least when I sin, I come back to Him. At least when I sin, I don't justify it. This is a person who fears Allah. Hence the Quran said, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَخْشَوْنَ رَبَّهُمْ, those who fear Allah, لَهُمْ مَغْفِرَةٌ, they have forgiveness. Wait a second, I thought if someone fears Allah, he never commits a sin to be forgiven. The Quran said, no. Fearing Allah brings about the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The more you fear Allah, as in, the more you have a sense of accountability to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You don't give yourself a green light to do as you wish. The more the doors of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opens up upon you. The fear of Allah and the mercy of Allah are two sides of the same coin. They are inseparable from one another. This modern spirituality that we are hearing about nowadays, yes? Where it's as if you shouldn't speak a lot about the fear of Allah. It's the elephant in the room. Oh yes, you should feel very spiritual, but don't talk about this fear thing. No. The Quran said, first you have to build a sense of accountability to Him. First you have to acknowledge that you're not an outlaw. You don't get to do just as you wish. Then this is a very spiritual thing to do. Because there's a lot of humility built into knowing that I am not in charge, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in charge here. There's a lot of humility built into, I don't have a green pass and a green light to do as I wish. No, there's a day where I will not have power. Just acknowledging this, just having this sense of accountability. Shaykh, sometimes I have this sense of accountability, but shaitan tricks me. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came and gave you a promise of forgiveness for what then? He said, the one who fears me, there is forgiveness for him. This is why. Because the one who fears Allah at a lower level, at times shaitan gets the best of him. So the mercy, the forgiveness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and fearing Allah go hand in hand. They are not separable from one another. Hence the narrations say you have to have this fear in your heart. This is why, brothers and sisters, the first Imam, Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi, he has a beautiful narration attributed to him. He said, Man ahabba, whoever wants to know, kayfa manzilatuhu indallah. Whoever wants to know what status he has in the eyes of Allah. Isn't this a question that comes to our mind every now and then? Ya Allah, am I a 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10, spiritually? Yes, spiritually. When you look at me, do you think of me as a great servant of yours? As a neutral servant of yours? As a not so great servant of yours? This is a question we're all curious about, yes? Where do I stand on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's spiritual evaluation of me? Yes? The Imam answered this in that narration that's attributed to him. He said, Man ahabba, whoever wants to know what his status is in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He doesn't have to look here or there or wait for some dream. He said no. If he wants to know where he stands in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all he has to look at is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala stands in his eyes. What is the importance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his eyes when he comes across sin? Does he say, it's not a big deal, do whatever you want to do? Or do all of his alarms go off when he comes across sin? He may not be perfect. He might commit sins from time to time, but he never gives himself green pass. The one who comes across sin and he recognizes that the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes his way. So the Quran said, تَخْشَعِرُّ مِنْهُ جُلُودُ الَّذِينَ يَخْشَوْنَ رَبَّهُمْ. These people, they begin to shiver And then the Quran said, ثُمَّ تَلِينُ قُلُوبُهُمْ وَجُلُودُهُمْ إِلَى ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. Then before they get too worried, they remember the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and they calm down. They have tranquility. Because they know the Lord that they have accepted His accountability is merciful. Now the doors of His mercy is open upon them. First and foremost step in any spirituality is accepting I'm not in charge. Is accepting that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who is in charge. Yes, then there is a form of fearing Allah. It is at a second level, beyond this level. Why? Because in the Quran sometimes and in narration sometimes the narration said there are people who fear Allah even though technically they can't even commit sins. This fear different from our fear. Why? The Quran said there are angels يَخَافُونَ رَبَّهُمْ مِنْ فَوْقِهِمْ. They fear their Lord who is above them. Fear their Lord who is above them. These are angels. Yes? Go ask anybody. They'll tell you angels, they can't disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes? Whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, verses of the Quran say. Yes? So but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَخَافُونَ. They have khawf. Why? Because this is khawf of the second type. Khawf of the second type is not about punishment and accountability and so on and so forth. Khawf of the second type is khawf where you're overwhelmed by a presence. It's too heavy for you. Yes? Even though you love that entity, it is overwhelming for you. Even though you love to meet that entity, you still show signs of being overwhelmed. You know these narrations, they say the Ahlul Bayt used to stand in prayer. Their feet used to get inflammation from standing in prayer so long. How many of the Ahlul Bayt has this been narrated about? Yes? This is not fear of the first type. This is fear of the second type, where they're in the presence of something that is so overwhelming for them. This is a natural reaction. This is not even done in an intentional manner. It's not like the Imam stood there and said, now I want to stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for so long until my feet become inflamed. No. When they stood, they were overtaken by His existence. One scholar gave a very interesting example. He said the women of Egypt, yes, when Yusuf walked into that gathering, yes, what happened to the women of Egypt? All they saw was one of the creation of Allah. And what did they do? They took these knives and they cut their hands. Go ask the women of Egypt, did you intentionally cut your hands with this knife? They'll tell you, no. What we were seeing was so amazing that we completely forgot about it. He said, this is how the Ahlul Bayt are. When they see the beauty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the magnificence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're overwhelmed by it. Maybe his feet are inflamed. He doesn't even know. It's not in this world anymore. It's not paying attention to this anymore. This is fear of the second type. But important point, the narrations of the Ahlul Bayt taught us, you cannot get to fear of the second type unless you start from fear of the first type. You cannot act all spiritual, oh Ya Allah, I want to worship you only out of love, before you learn to fear Allah in the first type. Before you make your way on this ladder of spirituality, the bedrock, the foundation is, oh Allah, if I do wrong deeds, there are consequences and I will be held accountable. Hence you find, and unfortunately speakers at times come, they say, listen, don't worship Allah out of fear. This is a very low level. Yes? Fear Allah or worship Allah out of love. Worship Allah because He is worthy of it. Yes? True, this is a narration that's been attributed to multiple Imams. And at the first and foremost of all of them, the first Imam, Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi. But when the Ahlul Bayt said there are three different levels to worshipping Allah, there are those who worship because of the love of heaven. They want to get into heaven. That is ibadatul tujjar. There are those who worship Allah out of the fear of hellfire. There are the ibadatul abid, the slaves. And there are those who worship Allah because He is worthy of it in some narrations, or because they love Him in some narrations, or because they want to be thankful to Him, shukran lahu in some narrations. This is true. These are 3 different levels. But you cannot get to level number 3 unless you begin from number 1 or number 2. Worshipping Allah because I know there are consequences to my deeds is very spiritual. It is very spiritual. This is a misunderstanding that we have, that worshipping Allah out of fear is this non-spiritual thing. Yes, he only worships Allah because he knows there's consequences to your deeds. Just knowing there's consequences to your deeds means you believe in the next world. You believe in the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You have humbled yourself in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What's more spiritual than this? This is very spiritual. This is why we find people say, yes, the Ahlul Bayt didn't worship out of fear. That is true. But that's not because they didn't fear Allah. Pay attention to this line. This is technical. It's not because they didn't fear Allah. They feared Allah. But they had graduated from that level. So now when they did things, they didn't do things out of fear, even though they did fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Where do we get this from? Suratul Insan, this famous story that we have heard. Yes? هَلْ أَتَى عَلَى الْإِنسَانِ حِينًا مِنَ الدَّهْرِ لَمْ يَكُنْ شَيْئًا مَذْكُورًا. And the verses continue. And then it comes to the Ahlul Bayt. And the Quran says that the Ahlul Bayt say, إِنَّمَا نُطْعِمُكُمْ لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ. We only give to you because of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. لَا نُرِيدُ مِنْكُمْ جَزَاءً وَلَا shukura. Yes? Then what does the Quran say? Inna nakhafu min rabbina. We fear our Lord. Yawman abusan qamtarira. We fear Allah and the accountability on the Day of Judgment. So they had this fear. Yes, because they had graduated from this level, that wasn't the reason why they would worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I can't get to that level unless I start from here. Worshipping Allah because I know my deeds have consequences is one of the most spiritual things that a human being can do. Yes, they feared Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well, but they graduated from this level to a different level. So fearing Allah is one of the most spiritual things that a human being can do. The moment you accept that, you have that sense of accountability between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now when you fall short, know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised His mercy for you. And this is how you have khawf and raja together. Yes? Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, have accountability to me and then watch my mercy come your way. This is why the Quran and Hadith has promised to us forgiveness in so many different ways. There are people, they still sit there, they say, will Allah forgive me? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promised you forgiveness 5 times a day for your salat. For your salat, forget about the Day of Judgment. For your salat. And even if the believer who fears Allah at a base level, yes, he doesn't do these things to remove his sin in this world, still Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kept a little bit of room for him, a little bit of hope for him in the next world. And that is what we refer to, something that Shia and Sunni believe in by the name of shafa'ah. Yes, there are differences on who carries this shafa'ah between the 2 schools of thought. Nonetheless, in Sahih al-Bukhari, you read, Ash-shafa'atul kubra. The greatest shafa'ah is given to who? It's given to our beloved Prophet, Muhammadin al-Mustafa, salawatullahi wa sallam alayhi. And of course, in our school of thought, we believe that this shafa'ah extends to the Ahlul Bayt as well. And of those who is given this shafa'ah, is the lady that we gather here during these days and nights to commemorate. Yes? Shaykh al-Saduq again has narrated a hadith in which Lady Fatima stands at the door of hellfire on the Day of Judgment. And as people come and go, the narration says, there are those who upon them is written al-muhibba, the lover of the family of the prophets. And there are those from these muhibbeen who easily make it into heaven. And then there are those, maybe like you and I, who come with many sins. They come with a lot of sins that they carried with themselves. And the narration says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala turns to one of them and points him in the direction of hellfire and tells the angels to take him in the direction of hellfire. And Lady Fatima calls out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, "Oh Allah, is it not true that Sammaytani Fatima? Is it not true that you gave me the title Fatima?" So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers back to her, "Yes, Fatima, I gave you the title Fatima. What does this mean? Because everyone who loves me and loves my family, فُطِمَتْ مِنَ النَّارِ, is separated from the hellfire. Is this not why you gave me this title? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds, this is why I gave you this title. O Fatima, on this day, everybody that you see has on his face written Al-Muhibb, a lover of your father and a lover of your family. Grab his hand, وَأَدْخِلِيهِ الْجَنَّةِ, and take him to heaven. This is that last mercy that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has waiting for us through this beloved lady. Yes? But what did they do to this lady who is a means of shafa'ah on the day of judgment? Sallallahu alayki ya Fatimata az-Zahra. Sallallahu alayki ya binta Rasulillah. Let us dim the lights and take our hearts, brothers and sisters, to the city of Medina. This holy lady, this lady who everybody believed in her spiritual status. Everybody believed in the status of the daughter of Rasulullah. This lady who her fada'il are known to Shia and Sunni. What did the people of the time of the Prophet do to this lady? They brought her to so much pain and through so much difficulty and through so many masa'ib. The narration says when she came and stood in the masjid of the Prophet, she had to go back to introducing who she was. And she stood in front of these people and she says, أقولها, I will tell you, أنا Fatima, I am Fatima. وأبي Muhammad, and my father is the messenger of God. أقولها عودا على بدء, I will tell you over and over again, because the way you're treating us and the way you're treating our family, it's almost as if my father did not put us as one of the thaqalain. It's almost as if my father did not tell you to take care of our family. The pain in the words of Fatima. And then she goes into the house and she shares her pain with Ali ibn Abi Talib. What did the heart of Ali go through during these days and nights? All the way in these last 2 or 3 months that Fatima is in this house, it came closer and closer when her illness and the masa'ib increased until maybe Fatima couldn't even walk in this house anymore. Just imagine the house of Ali during these days and nights where she can barely walk around anymore. She can barely take care of her duties anymore. And she is angry at those who took away her rights during this time. And she is angry at the government who took away her rights at this time. And the narration says those final days came and she turned to Ali ibn Abi Talib. And she began to speak of her wasiyah to Ali. Oh Ali. Now imagine what this did to the heart of Ali. Imagine Fatih Khaybar, the one who took care of the gate of Khaybar, how he's breaking in front of his young wife. How he looks at his wife melting away in front of him. She turned to Ali, Ya Ali, when that time comes where I take my final breath, I want you to take care of my kafn and dafn. I want you to take care of my ghusl. And she said, Oh Ali, وَسَوِّدْ تُرَابَ عَلَى وَجْهِ, pour the dirt on my body, pour the dirt on my face, place the lahad on my body. How can Ali listen to these lines of Fatima? And then she said, Ya Ali, when you do this, don't leave me in the graveyard. Stand by my grave, recite some Quran, because in those moments, a human being needs the recitation of Quran more than anything else. And the narration says that then Fatima turned to Ali, Oh Ali, let me give you another wasiyah. And this was the ghurba of Fatima. This was the loneliness of Fatima. She said, Oh Ali, make sure when you bury me, make sure that you bury me during nighttime. Make sure you bury me at a time where they cannot come and pray upon my body. Make sure you bury me at a time where I can show that between me and Allah I am displeased with them and I am not happy with what they did with me. And Ali is hearing the words of Fatima. The narration says slowly Fatima became weaker and weaker. And the narrations say at one point all of a sudden Ali saw Fatima is not speaking to him anymore. Fatima is speaking to somebody else. Fatima is speaking to these other entities. Then the narration says Fatima began, Assalamu alayka ya Jibreel. My salam goes to you, O Jibreel. Assalamu alayka ya Rasulallah. Salam upon you, O the Messenger of Allah. Assalamu alaykum, O the people of heaven, salam upon you. And Ali knew these were the final moments that he would be with his Fatima. The narration says all of a sudden the soul left the body of Fatima, and this hand of Fatima in the hands of Ali fell from the hands of Ali, and all of a sudden the lifeless body of Fatima lies in front of Ali. What happened to the heart of Ali in those moments? The Prophet had told him to be patient, but how patient did Ali have to be in these moments? And the narration says slowly Ali began to prepare the body of Fatima for the burial. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون